I showed up to my older sister's wedding wearing a dress I'd borrowed from a coworker 2 sizes too big and heels I'd dug out from the back of my closet, soles nearly worn through. It was held at this sprawling vineyard estate just outside Napa, all white stone and blooming lavender, the kind of place you'd only see in bridal magazines or those wedding influencer reels. The moment I stepped out of my Uber, which I'd almost canceled twice because of the cost, I knew I didn't belong. Everything screamed wealth and elegance. The driveway was lined with imported roses, a string quartet played under a domed gazebo, and uniformed waiters in crisp black suits were passing around champagne flutes before the ceremony had even started. I recognized no one. No one looked my way. Not the guests, not the staff, not even the woman checking the guest list. I said my name, Rachel Lynn Gallagher, and she blinked at the clipboard for a few seconds too long before giving a polite, disinterested smile and pointing toward the back garden. My sister, Julia, was the kind of person who was born to be admired. Everything she touched turned to gold. She was taller than me, blonder, had that natural elegance people couldn't teach. She graduated summa cum laude from Stanford, landed a job at a Silicon Valley startup, and within 3 years was a VP. Her face had been on the cover of business magazines. Our parents loved telling everyone how proud they were. Their voices would change when they talked about her, proud, affectionate, awed. When they spoke about me, it was in passing, like mentioning someone who used to live in the house but hadn't called in a while. I didn't expect a warm welcome. I hadn't been home for 2 years. Last time I'd spoken to my parents was when I asked for help with rent after getting laid off. They said they were disappointed I hadn't made better choices and suggested I reach out to my more successful sister for advice. Julia never answered my email. So when I walked into the reception space, I wasn't surprised that I didn't see my name on the first few tables. Those were for the important people, the groom's family, college friends, old money donors, and people who wore tailored suits with shoes polished like glass. I kept walking, scanning for a paper tent with my name. I passed table 6. Then 10. Then 15. It was near the back of the hall, right behind a column that blocked the view of the head table and most of the dance floor. My name was written in small cursive, set at a table that had only one chair. No centerpiece. No place setting at first. A waiter noticed and scrambled to bring me silverware. The tablecloth was wrinkled, and my chair wobbled. I sat down anyway, my chest hollow and my throat tight. I watched as laughter and conversation bloomed around me, a hum of celebration I wasn't part of. My sister wore a custom gown that flowed like water, her hair pinned in soft waves, makeup airbrushed to perfection. She looked like royalty, and I was a guest she had to invite for the sake of appearance. She didn't even glance in my direction. People passed me without stopping. I saw old family friends, neighbors, even a few distant cousins I hadn't seen in years. Not a single one said hello. It was like I didn't exist. I texted Mom once just to let her know I'd arrived. The message was read, but she didn't reply. A few minutes later, I saw her walk by with a glass of white wine in hand, laughing with someone from Dad's company. I opened my mouth to call her name, but something in me froze, and I stayed silent. Dinner was served. My meal came last, long after everyone else had started eating. I wasn't offered wine, and when I tried to flag down a waiter, he gave a tight smile and kept walking. I told myself it didn't matter, that I wasn't hungry anyway, but my stomach twisted every time I smelled roasted garlic and seared lamb drifting from other tables. The speeches started, echoing over the PA system. Stories about Julia's accomplishments, her beauty, how she always lit up a room. Her new husband's brother gave a speech about how he knew from the moment they met that Julia was someone special. There were inside jokes, anecdotes about family vacations I wasn't invited to, toasts to the perfect couple. No one mentioned me, not even once. The worst part wasn't being ignored. It wasn't the isolation or the cold glances or even the loneliness that clung to my skin like humidity. It was the fact that I had expected it. I'd rehearsed this exact feeling on the plane ride over. I told myself to be strong, to act indifferent. But sitting there, behind a stone column that blocked every beautiful part of the celebration, I felt 12 years old again. Back in our shared bedroom, listening to my parents congratulate Julia for her piano recital while forgetting I'd won 3rd place in the spelling bee the same day. When the dancing started, I slipped away to the bathroom, stayed in there for 15 minutes pretending to fix my makeup. No one noticed. When I came back, someone had accidentally taken my chair. I stood there awkwardly until a staff member brought me another one. It creaked every time I moved. Around 10:45, Julia walked by, holding her new husband's hand, laughing at something he whispered. She glanced my way for half a second, not even enough for eye contact, and then kept walking. That was the only time she looked in my direction all night. I left before dessert. Called another Uber, watched the vineyard lights blur through the car window as we pulled away. I didn't cry. Not then. Not until I was in the hotel room, in that too big dress, sitting on the edge of the bed with my phone silent beside me. No one texted. No one asked if I got home safe. I stared at the wedding program I'd taken from the table, her name embossed in gold, our parents listed as loving and supportive, and wondered how it was possible to feel like the ghost of someone still alive. I had already decided that I would leave right after the cake was cut, maybe even before, and spend the rest of the night curled up in the stiff hotel bed, wrapped in silence and disappointment. The noise of the celebration buzzed on around me, clinking glasses, muffled laughter, the occasional shriek from an excited bridesmaid, but none of it belonged to me. I had accepted my place in the background, swallowed it like a pill I'd been forced to take since childhood. It didn't matter that my dress itched or that the hem dragged on the floor when I walked. It didn't matter that my shoes pinched or that my name was misspelled on the place card. I was invisible, and that was the safest way to survive this kind of night. Or at least that's what I thought, until a voice, low and amused, cut through the noise and startled me like a sudden spotlight. "You look like someone trying very hard not to be seen," he said, and I looked up sharply, unsure at first whether the words had actually been meant for me. But they had. He was standing just beside my table, Daniel, he would later tell me, holding 2 glasses of champagne with the casual grace of someone who looked like he belonged everywhere. He wore a deep navy suit that fit his frame perfectly, not rented or hastily tailored, but something chosen carefully, like a man who knew what cut made him look both approachable and important. His tie had been loosened just enough to seem relaxed, but not messy, and his dark hair was swept back with an effortless kind of neatness that must have taken at least 20 minutes to achieve. I blinked, caught somewhere between confusion and mild embarrassment, unsure whether to smile or retreat further into myself. I hadn't spoken to anyone all evening, hadn't expected to. "Is it that obvious?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, self-deprecating, though the words came out a little too raw, like I'd lost the ability to act like I didn't care. He smiled, but it wasn't the polished smile I'd seen a dozen times that night, not the kind people wear when they're trying to impress or flatter or maneuver themselves into better company. His was slower, warmer, as if he found me genuinely interesting. He handed me one of the champagne flutes and took the empty chair beside mine without waiting to be invited, like someone who understood the dynamics of a room and didn't need permission to ignore them. "You've got that look," he said. "Like you're trying to disappear but also hoping someone might notice you before you do." His words landed with a weight I hadn't been prepared for. I wrapped my fingers around the glass and glanced away, not because I was offended, but because he was too accurate. Too precise. I hadn't told anyone how I felt that night. I hadn't needed to. Apparently, it was all over my face. "I'm Rachel," I said finally, my voice quieter than I'd meant it to be, like saying my name out loud was a risk I hadn't taken in a while. He nodded, like he already knew, or like he didn't care about formalities. "Daniel," he replied. "Friend of the groom." "Kind of. We were roommates for a year back in Chicago. He invited me out of obligation. I came for the wine." That made me smile, genuinely this time, the tension in my shoulders loosening by an inch. "And now you're talking to the invisible sister," I said, a bitter edge slipping in before I could stop it. Daniel tilted his head slightly, not dismissing the comment, not pretending he didn't hear the weight underneath it. "That's a hell of a title," he said, eyes scanning my face with a look that was neither pitying nor curious, just observant. "But you don't seem invisible to me." I didn't know how to respond to that. No one had ever looked at me like I mattered, not here, not in this context, not while Julia was glowing under the fairy lights just across the courtyard, surrounded by admirers and family and all the love I'd never been able to hold in my own hands. "Do you always say things like that?" I asked after a pause, not quite meeting his eyes. "To strangers behind pillars?" "Only the interesting ones," he said. "And only the ones who look like they need to hear it." We sat there for a while, and to my surprise, the silence between us felt easy, not forced. I sipped the champagne, which was colder and crisper than anything I could afford on my own, and Daniel didn't push for more conversation. He just sat beside me, elbows resting on the table, watching the party with a kind of removed amusement, like he wasn't quite part of it either. Maybe that's what drew me to him, the way he seemed slightly out of place, not in a way that made him lesser, but in a way that made him separate. Like me. He asked about my work, and I told him, reluctantly at first, then with more ease, about the nonprofit I'd recently started working at, the long hours, the low pay, the occasional moments of purpose that made the struggle worth it. He didn't react with fake admiration or polite interest, he asked real questions. Thoughtful ones. The kind of questions people ask when they're actually listening. I told him about the city I lived in, about the crumbling apartment with the leaky pipes and the neighbor who played violin at 3 a.m. because he believed that inspiration didn't follow clocks. Daniel laughed at that, a Real laugh, deep and unexpected, and for the first time all night, I felt something crack open in my chest, not quite joy, but something adjacent. Something like relief. The party around us continued, oblivious. Julia was dancing now, her dress shimmering under the garden lights, and I realized I hadn't looked at the clock in over an hour. For a moment, I wasn't the forgotten sister. I was just a woman at a wedding, talking to a stranger who saw her as something more than a placeholder at a lonely table. I didn't know who he was beyond his name and his connection to the groom, but it didn't matter. He saw me. Not the way my parents failed to, or the way Julia never bothered to, but truly, as if I were made of flesh and feeling instead of just obligation and oversight. And for that brief stretch of time, behind the column and under the hum of distant laughter, I didn't feel invisible anymore. Daniel didn't ask. He simply stood up, extended his hand toward me, and looked at me like it was the most natural thing in the world. His expression was calm but intentional, the kind that didn't leave much room for hesitation, like he already knew I'd follow even if I wasn't sure why. I stared at his hand for a moment, my fingers twitching around the delicate champagne flute, still half full. Then I set it down, slowly, deliberately, and placed my hand in his. His palm was warm and steady, and as he closed his fingers around mine, I felt a flicker of something electric, not romantic, not yet, but charged, like motion after too long standing still. Without a word, he led me away from the table, around the column that had hidden me all night, and into the center of the reception space where the lights were brighter and the music louder and the people more alive. At first, I walked behind him, slightly out of step, hyper-aware of my awkward gait and the way my dress caught on my heels. But Daniel slowed just enough to match my pace, his grip tightening for a second in reassurance, and before long we were side by side, moving through the room like we belonged there. He started with the small groups. A cluster of men near the bar laughing over some shared memory, a pair of women comparing their stilettos, an elderly couple swaying gently near the dance floor. Each time, Daniel would nod or wave or call someone by name, then turn to me and say, "This is Rachel." No last name, no caveat, no awkward titles like the bride's sister or plus one. Just Rachel. And he said it like it meant something. Like I meant something. People looked at me. Really looked. Not the fleeting, impersonal glances I'd been collecting all night like crumbs, but eyes that lingered, that studied, that smiled. It took me a few interactions to realize what he was doing. With every introduction, he dropped small, powerful phrases. "This is Rachel, she works in advocacy, she's doing some amazing stuff in the city, you two should connect, she has the sharpest insight on community outreach." None of it was flashy or exaggerated, but it redefined me in real time. He took the version of me that had been erased and rewrote it, word by word, until I started to recognize myself in the reflection of others. Heads turned. Slowly at first, like ripples spreading from a stone in water, then more openly, more intentionally. People stepped into our path instead of around it. Someone complimented my dress, even though I knew it wasn't designer or particularly flattering. Another woman leaned in to ask about my nonprofit, and I fumbled over my words at first, caught off guard by genuine interest. But Daniel filled in the gaps when I faltered, not speaking over me, but beside me, adding just enough to keep the thread going. With every passing minute, I stood taller. My spine straightened. My voice steadied. My laugh stopped sounding like an apology and started sounding like it belonged there. At one point, I caught sight of my mother across the room. She was standing near the cake table, talking to one of Julia's college friends, her hands gesturing in that familiar, animated way she used when trying to impress. She noticed us, or rather, she noticed me, her eyes landing on the sight of her younger daughter being pulled effortlessly into a conversation circle she wasn't supposed to be part of. For the briefest moment, her mouth parted, as if to say something or to process something unexpected. But she didn't move toward us. She just watched, a subtle tension in her jaw, then turned back to her conversation. It wasn't approval. It wasn't affection. But it was acknowledgement. And that, in itself, was more than I'd expected. Daniel kept moving, navigating the room with the quiet command of someone who didn't need permission. When we passed the photo booth, the photographer stopped us and offered to take a quick shot. I started to decline, instinctively, but Daniel squeezed my hand and said, "Why not?" So we stood there under the wide archway, and as the flash went off, I saw my reflection on the screen, my eyes bright, my cheeks flushed, my posture confident. For the first time all night, I looked like I belonged in the frame. We ended up near the edge of the dance floor, where the music had shifted to something slower, smoother, like the final hour of a long, luxurious party. Daniel turned to me, his hand still resting lightly against mine, and said, almost in passing, "You know what this is, right?" I raised an eyebrow, unsure if he meant the moment, the movement, or something else entirely. "This is how you change the narrative," he said. "You don't wait for people to see you. You show up and make it impossible for them not to." I didn't have a response to that. Not because I didn't believe him, but because I felt the truth of it settled deep in my bones. All night, I had let other people decide what I was worth. I had accepted my role as the forgotten sister, the shadow in the background, the one who didn't matter. But now, here I was, standing in the middle of a room that had ignored me just hours earlier, being seen, being heard, being remembered. And not because I'd changed who I was, but because someone had reminded me how to exist loudly in a space that wanted me quiet. Daniel didn't rescue me. That's not what this was. He offered me a mirror, a moment, and the quiet insistence that I deserved to be more than tolerated. And in taking his hand, in letting him walk me into the light, I realized I didn't need to disappear to survive. I could take up space. I could be visible. And for the first time in years, I wanted to be. The moment the microphone crackled, I felt my stomach drop in that slow, sinking way that only happens when you know something irreversible is about to unfold. I had just returned to our table, no longer hidden behind the column, but now pulled slightly toward the edge of the crowd, close enough to see the stage but still far enough not to expect to be part of it. The DJ had taken a brief pause between tracks, and a staff member was adjusting the mic stand when Daniel suddenly stepped forward, his jacket now unbuttoned, champagne in one hand, his other raised slightly in a casual wave as he addressed the room. I watched him with mild curiosity, assuming he was about to offer a generic toast to the couple or share an old college anecdote with the groom, something expected and quickly forgettable. But then I heard my name. Not just a passing mention. Not in the background or tucked into a list of polite acknowledgments. My full name, spoken clearly and confidently into the mic, as if it belonged in the air above 200 guests sipping premium rose and nibbling at lemon chiffon cake. For a second, I wasn't even sure he meant me. My hand froze mid-reach toward my glass, and I turned slowly, heart pounding, as heads around the room lifted and swiveled in my direction. Some people looked confused. Others curious. A few blinked in recognition, struggling to recall if they'd spoken to me, seen me, even noticed me before this moment. Daniel was smiling, calm and self-assured, the kind of presence that could command attention without raising his voice. "Before we continue with the dancing," he said, glancing briefly toward Julia and her husband at the head table, "I want to take a moment to talk about someone most of you may not have had the pleasure of meeting tonight. Her name is Rachel Gallagher. She's the bride's sister." The words landed like a stone dropped into glass. I felt the shift instantly, not just in the air, but in the posture of the people nearest me, in the way someone near the open bar actually lowered their drink. It wasn't just that he'd named me. It was that he declared my relation to Julia, publicly, proudly, with no caveat, no shame, no softening of the edges. And in doing so, he made it impossible to pretend I wasn't there. I could see my mother's expression tighten from across the room. My father leaned in, whispering something sharply into her ear, but she didn't respond. Julia's face was unreadable, her smile still in place, but stiff around the corners, like a mask that hadn't been removed in time. Daniel continued, his tone easy but deliberate. "Some of you might know Rachel works at a small independent bookstore in Portland. What you might not know is that she's quietly running one of the most thoughtful, community-driven outreach programs I've seen in years. She's built partnerships with schools, local shelters, literacy groups. She's coordinated donation drives and author talks and reading mentorships for underserved kids. And she does all this while shelving books, managing inventory, and, apparently, making the best espresso in the city. A ripple of laughter passed through the room, genuine this time, but I couldn't laugh. I couldn't even move. My cheeks were burning, but not from shame. It was something else. A heat that started in my chest and moved outward, like my body was catching up to the fact that I was being seen. Now, I know this isn't a professional conference, Daniel went on, still smiling, but his voice had deepened slightly, taken on a seriousness that made people lean in. But I'm in the middle of launching a new initiative, a community-centered creative hub in San Francisco. And after talking with Rachel tonight, I realized we need someone with her experience, her insight, her grounding. So I'd like to offer her a role as a consultant on the project. Not tomorrow. Not next year. Right now. Because someone like her? You don't wait on that kind of talent. There was a beat of stunned silence. Just long enough for the magnitude of what he'd said to settle into the cracks between the tables, into the wine-stained napkins and the flickering votives and the scattered programs with Julia's name in gold. I felt eyes on me from every direction, but they weren't cold or dismissive this time. They were sharp, attentive, studying me like I was suddenly a figure worth noticing, worth listening to. People who hadn't so much as nodded at me earlier were now turning fully in their chairs, angling themselves toward where I sat. I felt the muscles in my face tighten, unsure whether I should smile, nod, or run. My hands were clenched in my lap, one thumbnail digging into the meat of my palm to keep from shaking. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Daniel raised his glass then, lifting it just enough to include the whole room. To Rachel, he said. To doing good work. And to never underestimating the quiet ones. The toast echoed. A murmur of glasses lifting, clinks ringing out unevenly across the room. Some people joined because it felt appropriate, others because they were genuinely moved, and a few, like my mother, stayed completely still. But it didn't matter. For the first time in my life, my name had been spoken in a room full of people, not as an obligation, not as an afterthought, but as a declaration. Not for who I was in relation to Julia. Not as the sister. But as myself. I sat there, the stem of my glass shaking slightly in my fingers, overwhelmed not just by the gesture, but by what it meant. It wasn't about the job offer, although that was real and significant and unexpected. It wasn't even about the applause that followed, soft but sincere. It was about the rewrite. The live edit of my story, taking place in front of 200 strangers who had never bothered to ask who I was, until now. The room didn't erupt into chaos, but it shifted in a way that was just as undeniable. Like the air itself had thickened, heavy with the sound of whispers moving from table to table, passed behind half-lifted champagne flutes and exchanged between raised eyebrows and side glances. It was the kind of buzz that couldn't be silenced, only fed. The moment Daniel lowered the microphone and stepped away from the stage, everything around me started tilting, subtly, but unmistakably, toward me. I could feel it first in the way the closest cluster of guests angled their bodies slightly in my direction, not just looking, but watching, evaluating, reprocessing everything they thought they knew about me in real time. It wasn't curiosity, it was recognition. A recalibration. As if I had been a vague shadow in the background of someone else's photograph, and suddenly I'd been pulled into the foreground, fully lit, entirely undeniable. My parents were still seated at their table, both frozen in place like someone had pressed pause on a scene they hadn't been prepared for. My father's hand was clenched around the base of his wine glass, not lifting it, just holding it as though unsure what to do next. My mother had that pinched look she wore when the world veered off script, the same look she used to get when dinner guests showed up 20 minutes early or when Julia dyed her hair a shade too dark in high school. Only this time, it wasn't a scheduling error or a teenage whim, it was me, her other daughter, the one she had so cleanly edited out of her social script, suddenly being talked about into a microphone in a ballroom full of donors, lawyers, and business executives. And then there was Julia, or rather, Victoria, as she had insisted everyone call her ever since she moved to Palo Alto and decided her given name wasn't elevated enough. She was seated beneath a cascade of fairy lights and soft white orchids, in the center of the most carefully curated wedding tableau I'd ever seen. The silk of her dress shimmered each time she moved, but in that moment, she was perfectly still, her expression locked somewhere between disbelief and something far sharper. Her mouth was parted slightly, as if she were about to speak, but nothing came out. Her eyes didn't blink. They just burned toward me across the room, and for once, I didn't look away. What struck me most wasn't her silence, it was the fury she was clearly trying to conceal beneath it. Victoria was not used to being upstaged, especially not by me. Her whole life was designed around control, from her Pinterest perfect engagement shoot to her custom calligraphed wedding invitations and her endless brand partnerships on social media. And yet here I was, in a borrowed dress and $10 lipstick, suddenly made visible by a few well-placed words, and the room had shifted because of it. I was no longer just the sister. The bridesmaids, her army of beige chiffon and highlighter smiles, were still clumped near the cake table, but they were no longer giggling or posing for photos. Now they were whispering into each other's ears, glancing over their shoulders at me, their expressions oscillating between surprise and something closer to envy. These were the same women who hadn't said a word to me during the entire rehearsal dinner, who'd spent the morning getting ready with Victoria while I'd sat alone waiting to be told where to go, whether I was even supposed to be in the pictures. Now, I could see one of them motioning toward me with her phone in hand, as if trying to quietly Google the project Daniel had mentioned. Another actually walked toward me a few steps, then seemed to think better of it and retreated, stealing a glance back over her shoulder. My name was now a subject. It was being spoken. Repeated. Questioned. And not as a footnote or an apology, but as a point of interest. Of significance. My parents' friends, the ones who had known me since I was 12 but hadn't acknowledged my presence once all evening, were now clearly discussing me. One woman in a navy gown leaned in toward my mother and said something with a light tap on her arm, her eyes flicking in my direction, and I saw my mother's smile freeze mid-reply before she gave a tight, unnatural laugh that didn't reach her eyes. And then, the most surreal moment of all, Victoria's new husband, Cole, came over to where I stood. He approached with a practiced grace, the kind that came from years in venture capital, the walk of a man who knew how to sell himself and expected to be listened to. He looked like someone pulled out of a GQ feature on power couples, tailored three-piece suit, watch glinting under the lights, hair immaculately styled. But when he reached me, there was a slight flush in his cheeks that hadn't been there during the ceremony, and he looked at me differently than he had earlier, when I was just another guest seated behind a pillar. I had no idea, he said, extending his hand like we were meeting for the first time. Daniel speaks highly of you. That was impressive. I didn't shake his hand right away. I looked at it for a beat, long enough for him to feel the hesitation, before finally clasping it with a calm nod. Thank you, I said, keeping my voice even, measured. I wanted him to feel the shift too. He stayed there a moment too long, eyes flicking toward the stage, then back at me, like he was still recalibrating what category to place me in. I could almost see the mental spreadsheet behind his eyes, columns being adjusted, influence reweighed. Then he gave a polite smile and backed away, returning to Victoria's side, who was now sipping her champagne with the kind of rigid, mechanical movement that screamed she wanted to snap the glass in half. Something had broken open in the room, and I was standing in the middle of it, no longer invisible, no longer insignificant. I didn't need to say anything. I didn't need to prove anything. The power shift had already happened. And I wasn't the one who had forced it, I had simply stepped into the space that had always been mine, waiting quietly beneath years of dust and disinterest, finally illuminated by a single, undeniable moment. The DJ's voice came over the speakers again, a cheerful but rehearsed announcement inviting all the single women to the dance floor for the bouquet toss. The kind of tradition that had always made me feel ridiculous, like being herded into a designated corner to fight for a handful of half-wilted flowers as if they held some magical promise. I had no intention of participating. I wasn't even standing close to the action. I was several steps back, tucked near the edge of the dance floor, half watching, half pretending to sip what was now my third glass of champagne. But then someone, one of the bridesmaids, I think, gave me a playful nudge and said, "Go on, Rachel. You're technically still eligible." Her tone was forced, light, but something behind it sharpened when a few other guests turned to look, waiting to see if I'd comply. And for some reason, maybe the buzz of adrenaline still humming under my skin from the speech, maybe the way my name had finally been carved into the fabric of the night, I didn't resist. I walked forward. Slowly. Not rushing, not eager, but present. I stopped a few feet behind the main group, most of whom had clustered near the center, already laughing and calling dibs on the bouquet like it was a game of musical chairs. Victoria stood with her back to us, flanked by two bridesmaids, her pristine gown lifted just slightly so she could move more freely. She glanced once over her shoulder, just a quick flick of the eyes, and I saw her scan the crowd, probably counting her closest friends, measuring her aim. she didn't see me. Or if she did, she dismissed me the way she always had, an outlier, someone safely behind the spotlight. The music queued up, some upbeat, ironic pop song about love or luck, and the room leaned in collectively as Victoria raised her arms high above her head, bouquet clutched tightly, elbows flexed, a picture of graceful choreography. But just as she let it fly, someone in the front row, a cousin maybe, or one of the younger coworkers who'd had too much wine, stumbled. Her heel caught on the edge of the carpet, and she crashed into the women beside her, setting off a domino effect of flailing limbs and startled shrieks. A few shrieked in surprise, arms flailing upward instinctively, but the sudden motion skewed the trajectory of the bouquet, and instead of landing in the crowd, it sailed higher than intended, over the chaos, and directly into my arms. It wasn't planned. I didn't even lift my hands to catch it. The flowers, a tightly bound mix of white peonies and pale pink roses with silk ribbon trailing from the stems, hit my chest and slid into the crook of my elbow like they'd been passed to me intentionally. The impact made me stumble back half a step, startled, my fingers closing around the stems more out of reflex than desire. The reaction was instant. The crowd let out a collective cheer, some part amusement, some part shock, the kind of uproar that filled the entire ballroom and rolled off the walls like a wave. There were whistles, claps, exaggerated gasps, and one woman near the cake actually shouted yes, Rachel, loud enough that it echoed over the speakers. I stood frozen for a second, bouquet in hand, spotlighted under the chandeliers. The flowers felt heavier than they should have. My first instinct was to drop them, to hand them off, to retreat. But then I saw her, Victoria, standing with her arms still in the air, hands empty, back slowly turning as she realized something had gone wrong. Her eyes landed on me. And for the first time all evening, her smile cracked. Not the faint tension I'd seen earlier when Daniel had spoken my name, not the forced cordiality she wore like a designer glove whenever our parents' friends approached, this was different. Her jaw tensed. Her mouth twitched, struggling to keep the corners lifted. Her eyes flared with disbelief, then something uglier. It was subtle, controlled, but not enough. Not anymore. The tiny fracture in her composure spread like a hairline crack in glass, and she blinked, quickly, as though trying to recalibrate, to pretend it hadn't happened. But it had. I was still holding the bouquet, and I could feel the weight of every stare in the room. Her bridesmaids were frozen mid-laugh, half-posed for a photo that no one would want to keep. Our mother, still seated at the front, turned visibly toward me, her face pale and tight, one hand gripping the armrest like she could stop the moment from happening just by holding on to something solid. Even Cole, standing near the bar now, glanced from Victoria to me, his expression unreadable, but his focus clear. I had gone from background noise to front-page headline in the span of a minute. And the flowers, those perfect, curated blooms, were still in my arms. I smiled then. Not out of triumph, not even out of pettiness, but because there was nothing else to do. Because I finally understood that this moment wasn't about superstition or symbolism. It was about control. For all her perfection, her planning, her rehearsed image of effortless grace, Victoria had never seen this coming. She had spent years curating a narrative where I didn't exist, or if I did, I was an accessory, a cautionary tale. And now, in the middle of her own meticulously crafted wedding, surrounded by every person she had ever wanted to impress, I was standing at the center of her scene, not as an accident, not as an intrusion, but as someone the room had chosen to watch. The bouquet stayed in my hands. I didn't offer it up. I didn't apologize. I simply lowered it slightly, let the ribbons trail over my wrist, and nodded at Victoria, the smallest, most deliberate gesture I could give. She blinked once more, her smile collapsing completely for just a split second before she turned sharply away, speaking to no one. And just like that, the power balance shifted again, not with a microphone, not with a speech, but with a fall, a flight, and a catch that no one could undo. The night had begun to wind down. The music softened into slower, sleepier tracks, the kind meant to signal an elegant end to a long, exhausting celebration. Guests filtered out in small clusters, heels in hand, jackets slung over shoulders, murmuring goodbyes and half-drunk promises to keep in touch. I had made my way to the garden terrace just off the ballroom, needing air, my skin still buzzing from the intensity of the past few hours. The cold stone beneath my heels grounded me, and I stood there in silence, still holding the bouquet I hadn't meant to catch, the scent of peonies thick and strangely soothing in the cool night air. That's when Daniel found me again. He didn't call my name or announce his presence. I just felt it, the quiet shift in the air, the familiar gravity of his presence pulling at the edge of my awareness before I turned to find him standing a few steps behind me, hands in his pockets, gaze steady. He looked more serious now, less polished charm and more something else, something weighted. "I owe you an explanation," he said quietly, stepping forward, the door to the ballroom swinging shut behind him with a soft click. I blinked, confused, heart slowing from the adrenaline high. I hadn't realized I was still writing. "You mean about the speech?" I asked, but he shook his head once, the motion subtle but firm. "No," he said, pausing beside me, his voice low and measured, like each word had been practiced but still didn't come easy. "About everything." He leaned on the edge of the stone railing, facing me now, not smiling, not posturing. "Just real." I waited, my grip tightening slightly on the bouquet, unsure of what was coming but already bracing for it. "I didn't meet you by accident," he said finally. "It wasn't luck. Wasn't fate." The words didn't land like a betrayal. Not yet. They just opened something, an invisible door I hadn't realized was closed, now creaking on its hinges. "I saw you 3 weeks ago," he continued, "at the bookstore. You were helping a little girl pick out a book on astronomy. You spent nearly 20 minutes with her, walking through the aisles, explaining the constellations like you'd known her for years. Her dad was on a call the entire time, not paying attention. But you were. You had that kid believing she could go to space one day. And when she left, you didn't even realize anyone had noticed." I remembered the girl. Vividly. She had chocolate-stained fingers and a notebook full of hand-drawn stars. I hadn't thought about that day since. "I was in town meeting with a publisher," Daniel went on. "Your bookstore was across the street. I wasn't supposed to go in. I was just killing time. But I watched you for a while. Not in a creepy way, just curious. You had this presence. Like someone quietly holding up an entire world while everyone else ignored it." His voice shifted then. Just a bit. From admiration to something harder. "A few days later, I had my assistant find out who you were. I wanted to send a thank you note, maybe ask if you'd be interested in some consulting work. And then something strange came up. When your name was cross-referenced with Victoria's, we found a web of transactions tied to a joint family account. Withdrawals. Large ones. Consistent. Hidden under maintenance codes and event fees." I stared at him, chest tightening, the chill in the air suddenly cutting sharper against my skin. He watched me carefully, gauging my reaction. "Over the last 4 years, Victoria has siphoned more than $100,000 from your parents' trust accounts. Some of it was disguised as wedding planning. Some as business expenses for a startup that doesn't exist. She's been draining their funds to maintain an image, the house, the car, the designer wardrobe, the branding deals that were never real. All of it." I couldn't breathe. Or maybe I was breathing, but not deeply enough to feel it. The weight of his words pressed down on my ribcage, forcing my mind to race through every moment that had never quite made sense, every inexplicable expense my parents had covered, every excuse Victoria had given, every business investment they mentioned like it was a point of pride. The coldness in my mother's voice when I asked for help, the way they told me to be more like her. "I didn't plan to confront her tonight," Daniel said, softer now. "I didn't think I'd even speak. But when I saw how they treated you, when I realized they still didn't know, I couldn't let it sit anymore. I felt a strange heat rising behind my eyes, but it wasn't sadness. It was fury. Not the explosive kind. The slow, controlled kind that burns deeper the longer it's ignored." I looked at Daniel, trying to find some trace of deception, some hidden angle, but there was none. His face was open, steady, honest in a way that made me feel exposed. "They trusted her," I said, barely above a whisper. "They believed everything she told them." "I know," he replied. "And she counted on that." I looked back toward the ballroom, where laughter still drifted faintly from the open windows, where Victoria was probably posing for yet another round of curated photos, glass in hand, smile perfected. I felt something sharp click into place inside me. A realization I could no longer ignore. Daniel turned toward me again, his voice low and certain. "You weren't meant to be invisible, Rachel. She made sure you were. Because the more you faded, the more brightly she could shine. The truth settled like dust in the air between us, undeniable, gritty, impossible to ignore. And just like that, I finally saw the full picture. Not just the neglect, not just the family dynamics twisted into something cruel, but the architecture of it all. The years of manipulation, the cost of silence, the damage wrapped in glittering paper. Victoria hadn't just pushed me into the background. She had stolen the spotlight by stealing everything that could have been mine. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thin, matte black folder, unmarked, almost too ordinary in appearance, like it could have held wedding notes or seating charts or a list of song requests. But when he handed it to me, there was a finality in the way he let go of it, a weight not from the paper inside but from the decisions it demanded. I didn't open it right away. My fingers pressed against the edge of the cover, feeling the subtle give of cardstock, the texture slightly rough beneath my skin. I could sense what it contained without needing to see it: documentation, financial records, flagged transactions, screenshots, maybe even bank statements annotated in the margins. The proof of everything he had just told me. The numbers. The theft. The betrayal. Daniel said nothing as I held it. He didn't try to sway me or explain further. He simply looked at me, his expression steady, respectful, as if acknowledging that this moment, this choice, had to belong to me alone. There was no instruction, no implied demand. Only silence. And space. I stayed on the terrace for a while after he left. The noise from the ballroom continued on, quieter now, more fragmented, the final echoes of a party beginning to fray at the edges. Inside, people were probably lining up for coffee, stealing the last slices of cake, slipping centerpieces into tote bags when no one was looking. Victoria would be making her final rounds as the flawless bride, cheeks flushed from champagne, hand resting lightly on Cole's arm, laughing too loudly at something she didn't find funny. She wouldn't see it coming. Not yet. Not for hours. Not until I decided. I didn't make a scene. I didn't walk back in and hold the folder over my head or demand silence or expose her in front of 200 guests. I didn't interrupt her night or claw back the spotlight she had spent her life keeping from me. That would have been easy. Satisfying, maybe. But not mine. Not the way I wanted it. I had never needed to be loud to be heard. I just needed to be right. So I waited. I went back into the ballroom and stayed just long enough to thank the caterers, to smile politely at the people who now looked at me with newly respectful eyes, to say a quiet goodbye to Daniel with a glance that carried more weight than words. Then I slipped out and went back to my hotel, the folder pressed against my side like a second heartbeat. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the edge of the bed, thumbing through the documents page by page, line by line. Every withdrawal was there, mapped and marked. Every fabricated invoice, every forged vendor, every fabricated business expense neatly listed with routing numbers and recipient accounts. Over $100,000 drained from our parents' joint holdings, from trust funds, from inheritance buffers, from emergency accounts they thought were safe. Each dollar a layer of the life she had built. Each lie a rung in the ladder she had climbed. I delivered the folder the next day, quietly, directly to our parents. I didn't accompany it with an accusation or a dramatic confrontation. I didn't even wait for a response. I simply walked into their house, the one I hadn't been invited to in over a year, and handed it to my mother in the kitchen, where she stood loading the dishwasher as if the previous night had gone exactly according to plan. She took it with a faint wrinkle of confusion on her face, flipping it open with the kind of disinterest she reserved for unsolicited mail. But as her eyes moved across the first page, that look hardened, her mouth tightening, her fingers tensing on the edge of the folder. I didn't stay to watch her read the rest. I just turned, walked out, and let the truth speak for itself. What followed unfolded slowly at first, then all at once. Within days, the silence from their end shattered into activity, tense calls, hushed messages, one awkward voicemail from my father asking if I had time to chat. Then came the confrontation, not mine, theirs. The discovery. The unraveling. Victoria's explanations fell apart almost immediately under scrutiny. Her apartment, which was still under partial financial support from our parents, was the first to go. Then the job, or rather, the board position she'd fabricated with a startup that never existed. Her LinkedIn profile was quietly deleted. Brand deals vanished. Cole, it turned out, had never known the extent of her financial dependency on her parents, and once he didn't stay. Their marriage didn't make it to the end of the month. The perfectly curated life she had built, all marble countertops and staged morning routines and borrowed status, collapsed without the scaffolding of deception to hold it up. She lost everything. And I didn't have to lift a finger. I didn't visit. I didn't gloat. I didn't call. I simply stepped back into my own life, quiet and solid and real, and waited for them to see what they had chosen to ignore for so long. I gave them the chance to discover the truth on their own, and in doing so, I gave myself something even more powerful than revenge. I gave myself peace. It happened faster than I expected. In the beginning, I thought it might take months, maybe even years, for the full weight of the consequences to catch up to her. I imagined lawyers, slow investigations, polite denials from our parents, desperate attempts to maintain the illusion a little longer. But when the facade cracked, it collapsed. Her perfect world, held together by staged photos, fraudulent bank statements, and well-rehearsed lies, didn't erode gradually, it imploded. Gregory was the first to act. Barely 10 days after the wedding, after whatever version of the truth he managed to extract from the wreckage, he filed for an annulment. No drawn-out divorce, no settlements, no joint appearances in public. Just a swift, clean erasure. I didn't hear it from him directly, of course, but word traveled quickly, through mutual friends, family whispers, a clipped statement posted quietly on his company's press page. Irreconcilable misrepresentations was the phrase used, which in their world was the equivalent of a public indictment. He removed every trace of her from his social profiles. Photos disappeared. Tags unlinked. Within 72 hours, it was as though she had never stood beside him in that vineyard, never worn the $15,000 dress, never called herself his wife. Her job, or the illusion of it, crumbled next. The tech company she'd claimed to consult for released a formal statement clarifying that she had never been employed by them in any capacity. That was followed by an internal audit at a boutique marketing firm she occasionally name-dropped, which confirmed she had misrepresented her involvement and, in some cases, had used their logo and client names without authorization. They didn't just fire her. They sent a cease and desist. Even the influencer contracts she had scrambled to secure in the months leading up to the wedding began to pull out, PR reps issuing vague notices about integrity reviews, unpaid invoices quietly vanishing into inboxes she could no longer access. Then came our parents. The moment they finished reading through the documents I gave them, everything about their relationship with her changed. My father was the first to react, his silence louder than any confrontation. He didn't yell. He didn't call her names. He simply withdrew every support mechanism he had ever provided. Bank accounts frozen. Property access revoked. Scheduled deposits halted. For the first time since she was 16, she no longer had a financial safety net beneath her. My mother, on the other hand, reacted like someone watching their favorite glass sculpture shatter on the floor. She tried, initially, to justify it, to frame the lies as confusion or youthful mistakes. But denial has a short half-life when the proof is written in black ink and bank records. Eventually, even she couldn't explain away the wire transfers disguised as consulting fees, the event invoices with forged signatures, or the vendor expenses routed to her own personal account. They cut her off. Completely. Not just financially, but emotionally, socially. No family statements. No invitations to holidays. No more defending her at parties when people started asking questions. They didn't even warn her. They simply stopped answering her calls. The same parents who once praised her every move now refused to acknowledge her name in public. I don't know if it hurt her more than losing the money or the husband or the image, but I suspect it did. Because control had always been her currency. And now she had none. The phone call came 1 week after the annulment filing. It was late, past midnight, but the screen lit up with her name, and I stared at it for a long time before I answered. I didn't know why I picked up. Curiosity, maybe. Closure. Or the part of me that still remembered her as the girl I used to share bunk beds with, long before we knew what power or envy or betrayal even meant. The moment I said hello, she exploded. Her voice was frantic, shrill, wild in a way I'd never heard before, none of the poise, none of the social varnish. Just raw, frantic rage. You ruined my life, she screamed, the words jagged and breathless. Do you understand what you've done? I lost everything. Everything. I didn't respond at first. I just listened. You think this makes you better than me? She snapped. You think you've won now? You don't get to judge me. You never had what it took to be me. You never had the guts to do what I did. You've always been weak. It was almost fascinating, watching the unraveling happen in real time, even through a phone line. She wasn't angry because I'd exposed her. She was angry because I hadn't let her get away with it. Because for the first time in her life, the consequences she thought she could outrun had finally caught her. "You did this," she said again, her voice cracking now. "You destroyed everything I built." And I finally spoke. "No," I said, quiet but firm. "You destroyed it. I just made sure no one kept pretending it wasn't happening." There was a silence then. A hollow, stunned silence, like she couldn't believe I'd said it out loud. I think, in some way, she expected me to apologize. To backtrack. To explain. To flinch under the weight of her fury the way I had for years. But I didn't. I let the silence stretch out, heavy and clean. And when she didn't speak again, I hung up. She never called back. In the weeks that followed, I heard through mutual contacts that she'd moved out of the city. No one knew where. Her accounts went private. Her once active social pages abandoned. The friends who clung to her during the height of her reign now quietly removed photos, untagged memories, rewrote histories to exclude her. Her empire hadn't just fallen, it had been erased. And I didn't have to fight. I didn't have to scream. All I had to do was hold up the truth and let the light do the rest. While her carefully manufactured world collapsed in on itself, mine, quiet, sturdy, long overlooked, began to rise in ways I could never have imagined. The consulting offer Daniel had made that night wasn't symbolic. It wasn't a gesture of pity or some exaggerated performance designed to humiliate my sister. It was real, concrete, and already waiting for me. A week after the wedding, I signed the initial contract. 2 weeks after that, I was sitting in a conference room overlooking Elliott Bay, surrounded by architects, city planners, cultural liaisons, and nonprofit heads, all of them listening as I explained the value of equitable design and accessible creative spaces. For the first time in my life, when I spoke, people didn't just nod politely. They took notes. The first project I worked on was a community hub in South Seattle, a converted shipping warehouse intended to house rotating exhibits, free after-school programs, and a mobile library. I brought in the bookstore experience, the grassroots knowledge of what underserved neighborhoods actually needed, not what urban developers assumed they did. I recommended partnerships with local artists, suggested quiet rooms instead of open-plan chaos, argued for the inclusion of multilingual signage and free childcare during events. At first, I expected resistance, the kind of polite dismissal I'd grown used to over the years. But something had shifted. People weren't just listening, they were respecting me. Referring to me by name. Quoting me in briefs. Within months, I was being invited to sit on advisory boards, asked to speak at panels. Not as someone's sister. Not as a token voice. As someone with expertise. My office was modest. A second-floor space above a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, with uneven floors and sunlight that poured through the front windows in the early afternoons. But it was mine. The desk, the plants, the mess of sticky notes on the wall, the stack of books I never had time to finish, all of it built from work I had done with my own hands, my own voice, my own knowledge. No one handed it to me. No one claimed credit. I didn't need to prove I deserved to be in the room. I had earned my seat. By the end of the year, I was managing 3 separate cultural revitalization projects across Seattle. One in a neglected park near Rainier Valley, where we turned cracked concrete into an open-air gallery and live poetry stage. Another in a former DMV building in Northgate, transformed into a collective studio and community kitchen. The third was a multi-phase redevelopment of a shuttered school into a living archive for immigrant family histories, a project that would have never existed if I hadn't pushed for a planning process that invited real voices to the table. There were headlines. Not front-page news, but thoughtful features in local weeklies. The bookstore consultant changing urban culture. Rachel Gallagher, designing space for stories that matter. I clipped one of them and pinned it to the corkboard behind my desk, not out of vanity, but because it felt like evidence, not just to others, but to myself, that the years I spent being overlooked hadn't been wasted. They had taught me how to see what others missed. How to notice what wasn't being said. How to build something meaningful, brick by brick, when no one thought you belonged in the blueprint. I didn't call my parents to tell them about the projects. I didn't ask for approval or recognition. I knew they saw the articles. My father was a subscriber to one of the city journals that featured my work. My mother, for all her silence, had friends who attended the opening night of the park installation and told her who was behind it. But I didn't wait for their praise. I no longer needed it. I no longer measured my success by the attention I received from people who had spent years pretending I didn't exist. My identity wasn't a reaction to theirs anymore. It wasn't tethered to what they thought of me or what my sister had done. I wasn't a foil to her downfall. I was a builder. A writer of spaces. A quiet force that didn't ask for applause. I created rooms where overlooked people could take up space, and in doing so, I finally took up my own. I used to think visibility came from being chosen. From being plucked from the shadows and placed into the light. But I learned it doesn't work like that. You step forward. You make yourself known. You speak clearly, and you keep speaking, even when the room doesn't echo back. I didn't need anyone to validate me anymore. I had evidence. I had work that spoke louder than their silence ever could. Daniel remained in my life, not as a savior or a romantic possibility, but as something far rarer, an anchor that never asked me to become smaller in exchange for stability. We stayed close in the kind of way that doesn't need definition or performative loyalty. There were meetings, projects, long walks through neighborhoods with crumbling infrastructure where we'd talk about public access and cultural equity as if we were designing a city from scratch. He respected my ideas without coddling them. He challenged me when I defaulted to self-doubt. But never once did he try to take credit for what I became. He didn't stand in front of me to protect me, and he didn't push from behind to propel me. He stood beside me. Always. People often mistook our closeness for something romantic, tried to reduce it to a narrative they could more easily digest. Man enters, sees hidden woman, brings her to light. That wasn't what this was. That was never what it was. Daniel didn't pull me out of the shadows, he turned the light on and pointed it at the room. He held up a mirror, not to me, but to everyone else, and forced them to see what they had refused to look at. My parents, who had spent years convincing themselves that praise was earned only through prestige. My sister, who had weaponized perception until it shattered in her hands. The guests at that wedding, who had looked past me like I was furniture. The colleagues who didn't see me until someone more powerful told them to pay attention. He didn't ask them to admire me. He forced them to confront their own blindness. And once they looked, once they saw me, truly saw me, not as the contrast to Victoria, not as a quiet detail on the margins, but as someone with weight and voice and purpose, I refused to let them forget what they saw. I carried that mirror with me into every room I entered afterward. Every boardroom, every planning session, every fundraiser, every late-night city hall meeting where someone tried to speak over me or redirect the conversation to a man in the room. I made sure they remembered. Not because I needed revenge. Because I needed it to mean something. I didn't rebuild myself from scraps of what was left after my sister's fall. I built a new structure altogether. A foundation that wasn't dependent on who approved of me or who claimed me. I designed a life that reflected who I had always been beneath the silence, perceptive, grounded, relentless in my pursuit of what mattered. And Daniel? He simply held the first mirror steady. Not to show me who I was. I already knew. But to show everyone else what they'd been trying not to see. That's what power really is. Not in being seen. But in deciding what people can no longer ignore. Revenge didn't come the way I used to imagine it when I was younger and angry and aching for someone, anyone, to acknowledge how much it hurt to be overlooked. It didn't come in dramatic confrontations or door-slamming arguments, no voices raised in lobbies, no public humiliation, no meticulously crafted speeches delivered with shaking hands in front of an audience waiting to choose sides. It didn't come in flames or fury. It came slowly. Quietly. With intention. It came in the form of visibility. In being recognized without apology. In being asked for my opinion in rooms I was once never allowed to enter. In invitations addressed to me, not as an extension of my sister or as a background figure, but because of my name, my work, my voice. It came in the way people looked me in the eye and didn't immediately search for someone more important standing behind me. The real revenge was not in watching Victoria fall. That was simply the inevitable result of a life built on manipulation and facades. What mattered, what truly marked the turning point, was that I didn't have to push her to the edge. I didn't have to drag her secrets into the light kicking and screaming. I held up the truth and walked away, and the truth did what it always does when someone finally has the nerve to stop protecting a lie. She fell, yes. But I didn't follow. I rose. I filled the space she tried to take from me my entire life. I stepped into it without permission, without waiting for someone to tell me I was allowed, and I stayed there. I didn't sneak around the edges of other people's comfort or shrink myself to be digestible. I expanded. I became too large to be ignored, not because I shouted, but because I stopped apologizing for taking up room. The same room she'd once forced me to the margins of. She spent years building a life on my silence, assuming I would always stay quiet, that I would always remain beneath her. She learned the hard way that the foundation she was standing on was made of paper, and I was no longer willing to hold it up. The victory wasn't in what she lost. It was in what I claimed. I no longer had to measure my value against hers, or chase after the approval of parents who didn't know how to see beyond titles and polished surface. I had my own path now, paved with work that meant something, with relationships built on truth, with a voice that had found its volume. Every step I took, every project I led, every time someone introduced me in a room as an authority instead of an afterthought, that was the real revenge. Not fire. Not spectacle. Just presence. She tried to climb by stepping over me. What she didn't expect, what she never saw coming, was that I would rise while she fell. Not in spite of her, but because I finally stopped letting her existence define mine. And when the dust settled, when her name faded from headlines and her invitations stopped arriving and her life shrank back into silence, mine didn't. I stayed visible. I stayed loud. I stayed exactly where I belonged.